Olá pessoal, aqui é o Eduardo do The News. Vim contar quem tirei no amigo secreto de podcasters do TikTok. Foi o Beto Estrada, do Matando Robôs Gigantes. Escolhi de presente pra ele um livro maravilhoso, realista e com foco em questões sociais, que bombou no TikTok. Sabia que agora já tem até um musical dele? É o Torto Arado, do Itamar Vieira Júnior.
O TikTok esse ano fez milhões de pessoas voltarem a ler. Um simples TikTok pode gerar um grande impacto. Descubra livros incríveis e muito mais no TikTok.
Sonhei fazer faculdade, mas tem medo de não dar conta? Calma, escuta só o recado da Rebeca Andrade.
Brilha sem medo. A universidade é o seu lugar, sim. E a Estácio tem soluções que provam isso. Acredita, eu também sou aluna.
Viu só? Agora aproveita que os cursos estão a partir de R$ 129 por mês e inscreva-se em estácio.br.
Brilha sem medo. Brilha como a maior do Brasil.
This episode contains discussions of extreme violence from the very start. At the cantonment of Meerut, on the 10th of May 1857, the parade ground was lined by two regiments of the Bengal Native Infantry, the 11th and the 20th. The sepoys were miserable and anxious. The previous day, they had been forced to watch as 85 troopers of the Bengal Light Cavalry were clapped in irons and sentenced to 10 years hard labour. The sentencing had taken 2 hours, and the rest of the Indian soldiers were forced to stand, unarmed, between regiments of armed European troops. The 85 troopers had been condemned for insubordination. In particular, they had refused to load their weapons. Across the regiments of the Bengal Native Infantry, sepoys were being armed with new weapons, the Pattern 1853 Enfield rifle, which was loaded with a cartridge made of greased paper. But rumours had been spreading for months that the grease on these new cartridges was a mix of pig and cow fat. The rumours said that this was no accident, and this was a British ploy to violate the faith of Hindu and Muslim sepoys, leaving them socially and spiritually vulnerable to conversion to Christianity. Once the sepoys, the backbone of British rule in India, were converted en masse to Christianity, then the rest of India would follow. This was the most famous rumour, but there were others along similar lines. It had come to the point that any cartridges provided by the British were now suspect. The 85 troopers had refused to load their weapons, even though they were using their old weapons and old cartridges. The new cartridges hadn't even arrived in Meerut. The soldiers of the BNI had sworn to refuse them too, and now they'd seen the consequences. Worse, they had stood by and let their comrades face punishment. Now, on that Sunday afternoon, they were waiting for the second shoe to drop. Everyone had heard more rumours that thousands of shackles were being forged to imprison and enslave any sepoy who refused the cartridges, and the sepoys of the 11th and the 20th wondered if they would be next. Down in the bazaar of Meerut, the tension spiked with the spread of alarming news. The British garrison was on the way to the parade ground to seize the Sepoys magazine and leave the Indian troops defenceless. Sepoys in the bazaar raced back to their lines to warn their comrades, and a large crowd followed closely behind them. How exactly this rumour started is unclear, because there was no truth to it. There was no truth to any of these rumours. But such was the suspicion and distrust, they spread like wildfire. Captain Taylor of the 20th Bengal Native Infantry arrived at the sepoy lines. Everyone seemed tense, but calm enough that Taylor hadn't even come armed. The officers walked through the lines as the crowd of civilians heckled the sepoys, reassuring their troops that everything was fine. No one was coming to take the magazine. Though the crowd from the bazaar remained agitated, Taylor and the other officers maintained the discipline of their troops through calm words and good-natured cajoling. Then a sawar, a cavalry trooper from the BLC, raced onto the parade ground and shattered that calm. He yelled out to the sepoys, "The British are coming. They're coming to take the magazine. You have to act now." The crowd erupted, yelling at the sepoys to do something, to act quickly. Any hold Taylor and the other officers had over their soldiers snapped in the confusion. The 20th BNI rushed the magazine, breaking into it and arming themselves. The first soldiers to load their weapons began firing into the air. Others ran to the closest officer bungalows and set them on fire. Taylor and the other British officers impotently tried to restore discipline over their troops. Meanwhile, on the other side of the parade ground, the soldiers of Colonel Finnis's 11th BNI were currently standing and nervously watching their friends and comrades mutiny. The 20th began to shout towards the 11th, urging them to join them in defending themselves against the British plot. They began shooting in their direction, trying to force them to pick a side. The 11th BNI were unarmed, and Colonel Finnis was begged by the soldiers next to him to give them their weapons so they could drive off the 11th. Instead, Finnis made the brave but foolhardy decision to ride over to the mutinying soldiers and demand they stop this madness. When he did, a sepoy shot and injured his horse. Finnis realised that this situation might require more than just a stern word, and he turned and tried to ride away, but one of the other soldiers chased after him and shot him in the back. Finnis fell from his horse, and as he bled out in the sands of the parade ground, a group of sepoys took position and executed him with a volley of fire. With Finnis's death, the 11th had, in their minds, lost any choice. Insubordination was one thing, mutiny another, but the murder of a British officer? They would all be hanged. The 11th joined forces with the 20th, breaking into their own weapons stores and firing on their officers as they fled. The killing of Finnis removed any restraint remaining among the sepoys of the 20th, and the ruthless logic demanded the silencing of witnesses. They turned on their own officers. Captain Taylor managed to fight his way out, but another captain and a British civilian were shot dead. The officers of the 11th and the 20th, as well as a small number of sepoys and Indian officers who remained loyal, fled from the parade ground and into the streets of Meerut. Some of the sepoys were furious at how their hands had been forced, and the sepoy who had shot Finnis in the back was confronted and killed in the chaos. Across town, 40 troopers from the Bengal Light Cavalry rode to the jail to release their 85 imprisoned comrades. By now, the civilians of the cantonment had thrown themselves into the mutiny. Taylor grouped up with 5 other officers, and they fled, unarmed, on foot, through the streets. Every corner seemed to show another crowd baying for their blood. They found a temporary refuge in the house of another officer, but the crowd set it on fire. Captain Taylor and 2 others from his group tried to escape, but the crowd of civilians and sepoys cut them down. The other 3 survived only by hiding in the toilet. All across Meerut, the sound of gunfire and the smoke of burning bungalows filled the air, as the thread which tied the sepoys to their officers snapped. Without the sepoys, company authority in Meerut collapsed, and the sepoys were joined by civilians, by prisoners, and by police. When the post carriage was attacked and its escort of 3 soldiers murdered, the postmaster's sister, Kate Moore, sent word to her father in Agra by telegram. The 20th have mutinied, killed several of their officers, and are setting fire to the station around us. This was the first message out of Meerut, which warned about the mutiny. When her brother then tried to send a more detailed report to the authorities, the telegraph lines had already been cut. But the British were not the only ones trying to spread word of what was happening in Meerut. By the time the rest of the British garrison retook the cantonment, the bulk of the mutineers had already left. Some had gone back to their homes, but most took the roads south. In earlier times, a band of soldiers who felt that their master had been unjust towards them might revolt and seek employment with another ruler. But there were no other rulers. The sepoys at Meerut and elsewhere had helped the company establish its supremacy over all the Rajas, Nawabs and Nizams they might turn to. But there was one figure they could still serve. A ruler who all sepoys, Hindu or Muslim, would answer to. A man who had no army of his own, who had been dishonoured and dispossessed by the company, and who was only 40 miles away. The mutineers marched to Delhi to offer their services to Bahadur Shah, the last Mughal emperor. Welcome to Winds of Change, Season 1, Episode 3, The Sepoy Mutiny and Indian Uprising. Welcome to Winds of Change. I am Dr. Samuel Hume, and on this podcast we will be discovering how the sun set on the British Empire. Last time, we saw the East India Company expand its control over the Indian peninsula. From its centres of power in Bombay, Madras and Calcutta, the corporation extended its authority over the land and people of India. This had devastating consequences in Bengal, where a famine killed perhaps a third of the native population, while company servants, by and large, continued to extract tax and revenue from the starving province. As reports filtered back to Britain about the horrors of the famine, the company's callous treatment of its new subjects was criticised by its many opponents. Soon after, the company nearly collapsed in a financial crisis, and the resulting bailout of the British government came at the price of state oversight of the company. Over the following 80 years, the East India Company waged wars, conquered territory, annexed client states, and ruled from behind the thrones of dozens of Indian sovereigns who still claimed autonomy. I asked Christina Welsch, assistant professor of history at the College of Wooster and an expert on the East India Company's military, to explain how this expansion happened.
Once you get into the 19th century, there's various periods within the East India Company that are considered more expansionist. Some of this is in terms of military campaigning. The expansion of the East India Company's army, its size and its scale, and the demands of its officers and soldiers for kind of military victory, for prestige, and literally plunder in many cases, becomes a kind of inescapable sort of feedback loop, where basically the company always needs to be on a campaign in order to kind of meet the demands of the army that's so central to the way that it is governing. So that helps to push campaigns not only into the Northwest, but also into Burma and parts of Southeast Asia.
One of those Indian sovereigns who fell under the hegemony of the company was their de jure overlord, the Mughal emperor himself. After defeating the Marathas at the Battle of Delhi in 1803, the company took over the protection of the man they, on paper, owed allegiance to, who they, again on paper, ruled on behalf of. But from 1803, the Mughal emperor was effectively a powerless ornament of the East India Company, his jurisdiction extending only to the walls of the Red Fort. As the company continued to expand over the first half of the 19th century, any possibility of a reversal of his position disappeared. In 1835, the British demoted the then Mughal Emperor, Akbar II, styling him merely King of Delhi, and renouncing any subservience to him. In 1837, Akbar died, and his son Bahadur Shah Zafar became King of Delhi. With the end of the Second Anglo-Burma War in 1853, the East India Company now held sway over the vast majority of South Asia, from Punjab in the northwest to Burma in the northeast, and everything to the south. The bulk of these conquests were won through the efforts of native Indian soldiers employed by the company, the Sepoys. But in today's episode of Winds of Change, we will see those Sepoys turn against the company. Against a background of suspicion and rumours, on the 10th of May, 1857, most of the Sepoys stationed in the town of Meerut mutinied, killed their officers, and were joined by hundreds of civilians. What starts in Meerut soon spreads across North India. Led by European officers, the presidency armies of Bengal, Bombay, and Madras were highly effective military forces, with the financial strength of the company and the British Empire behind them. By the end of 1856, there were around 250,000 sepoys under arms in the company armies. There were about 6,000 European officers in charge of them all, which was nearly as many officers as there were in the actual British army. The European officers were a powerful political faction in their own right. Their authority over their Indian troops was taken as not just a fact, but an invaluable bargaining chip. It was only by the strength of Indian arms that the company was able to conquer and control such a vast territory, and it was only the officers who kept those sepoys loyal and obedient. When the government of the company, or the British government itself, attempted reforms, they were often stymied by the resistance of these officers.
And the argument is that the East India Company relies on its army composed predominantly of sepoys, but that it is only through the active and strong leadership of white officers, that sepoys can be made as useful soldiers and as loyal soldiers. So they often make a claim that any attempt to reduce the prestige or the authority of officers would reduce their status in the eyes of their sepoys, and thus render the possibility of a sepoy revolt more likely. This becomes very effective as a tool in challenging efforts at reform.
There's a lot of accounts in these officers' own words which illustrate how they saw their relationship with their soldiers.
The idealized language is often of this kind of paternal indulgence. The ideal officer is one who wins the affections of his sepoys as if they were his children. In practice, this, of course, really falls apart. Even in periods where the East India Company is really pushing officers to learn Indian languages, it is extremely clear that very few officers had any degree of fluency in any Indian language.
Not all was well within the ranks. For starters, the Europeans always held superiority over any Indian. Even after decades of service, there was only so high that an Indian officer could climb. In the early decades of company expansion, the relationship between European officers and their sepoy soldiers were more cordial. Not that it was ever a relationship of equality, but some British officers did learn Indian languages. Many more had relationships with Indian women and attended both Hindu and Muslim festivals. Even though it was a deeply paternalistic bond run through with prejudice, they knew their men, and their men knew them. But as the 18th century entered the 19th, and the company expanded more and more, there was a noticeable change in the attitude of officers sent from Britain. It was very rare for an officer to learn even the basics of Indian languages, and they relied on Indian officers and servants to act as translators for every conversation and order. Many officers serving in India brought their British wives, so no more fraternization with local women. British society in India had also grown in size and sophistication. The social class of company officers also rose, which brought its own baggage. More than ever, Europeans only lived alongside, dined with, and socialized with other Europeans. But the officers still believed they held the loyalty of their Indian subordinates. But British rule in India was not backed up only by the company sepoys. The company also employed around 15,000 Europeans as ordinary soldiers, who were mostly in charge of the artillery. Almost a quarter of the entire British army was stationed in India as well. There's an interesting dynamic at play in the treatment of European and Indian soldiers, and between government and company soldiers. During the decades of the company's expansion, Indian sepoys won a number of privileges which were denied to European soldiers. For example, sepoys could be discharged from service or executed, but they were generally not whipped. It was believed that the high-status castes of Brahmins and Rajputs, who made up a substantial portion of company armies, would either desert or not join up at all if faced with that public humiliation. In contrast, corporal punishment was considered standard in the government army, where the soldiers were viewed as, in Wellington's famous summation, the scum of the earth. Of course, the company didn't offer these privileges out of the goodness of their hearts. The military market in India, at least in the earlier decades of company rule, was full of opportunities. Indian soldiers and officers knew that if they were mistreated by the company, then there was usually a Raja or a Nawab who was looking to pay top dollar for good men. They knew their worth, and they made sure the company valued it. But there were still mutinies by both sepoys and their European officers. At least 25 took place between the Battle of Plassey and the 1857 uprising. For example, the Vellore Mutiny occurred in 1806, when sepoys in the Madras army stationed in Fort Vellore turned on their European comrades and officers and massacred them in the night. Over 100 were killed, with more wounded, as the mutineers raised the flag of the annexed Sultanate of Mysore. The company quickly suppressed the rebellion, with more than 100 mutineers summarily shot. The British also made use of an old Mughal method of exemplary execution. 6 of the mutineers were blown away by cannon, tied to the mouth of artillery pieces, which were then fired. The treatment of mutinous European officers was very different. As part of a protest against plans to merge the company army with the Royal Army, these officers mutinied all across India. For these mutineers, they got what they wanted. The merger was called off, and the fate of the leaders was to be discharged and returned to Britain without any criminal charges. There wasn't a cannon to be seen.
Tem momento na carreira que precisamos dar passo além. É hora de fazer uma pós-graduação. Só que muitas vezes o custo pesa no bolso, inviabilizando tudo. Com a pós-graduação do Senac, você não tem esse problema. Cursos com até 50% de desconto e muito mais tempo para pagar. TCC opcional, modelo flexível com aulas presenciais e online e alguns cursos com apenas 12 meses de duração. Não tem mais desculpa, hein? Saiba mais em sp.senac.br/pós-graduação. Você que está ouvindo o seu podcast, já sabe qual é o efeito do novo Hyundai Creta N-Line em você? Sofisticado, com design e os acabamentos internos exclusivos da linha N-Line. Tecnológico, com o display panorâmico e todos os itens de assistência ao condutor. Confortável, com amplo espaço interno e o maior teto solar panorâmico da categoria. Bom, que tal você mesmo descobrir esse efeito? Chegou o novo Hyundai Creta N-Line, tão poderoso quanto o seu estilo.
So the question is, if there were other mutinies throughout the 19th century, why did a mutiny in 1857 escalate into a massive uprising against British rule?
What was unique in 1857 was the scale and the scope of the mutiny rather than the fact that there was a mutiny.
Kim Wagner, Professor of Imperial and Global History at King's College London and expert on the events of 1857.
But that is also a very sort of partial account, in the sense that what started as a mutiny in the East India Company Army quickly became a popular uprising, where peasants, traders, merchants, artisans, whole sort of cross-section of Indian colonial society, as well as dispossessed landlords and Indian rulers, rose against the British, often for very locally specific reasons.
One of those factors was leadership. For example, in the Vellore Mutiny, the sons of Tipu Sultan, the last ruler of Mysore, were in Fort Vellore, but they got cold feet about the rebellion. In 1857, there were enough disaffected Indian nobles to provide a form of disunited leadership once the uprising got momentum. I asked Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee, Chancellor of Ashoka University and historian of 1857, why this was.
The running theme is, the word used is Firangi. Firangi is actually white man or foreigner. These Firangis are trying to intervene and erode the very fundamentals of our life and existence, our religious practices, religious beliefs, our social customs, and so on and so forth. And in the process, they have over 100 years removed every single ruling dispensation in various parts of India through acts of betrayal, treachery, and other kinds of stabbing in the back. They haven't kept the terms of the alliances that they had made.
Someone who perhaps did more than anyone else to encourage this reputation was Lord Dalhousie, Governor-General between 1847 and 1855. Dalhousie was an annexationist. He looked at the map of British India, with its patchwork of subsidiary alliances, clients and puppets, all with their own agreements and privileges and autonomy, as well as independent neighbouring states, and thought it would be much nicer if it was all one single administration, a British administration. He spoke of a, quote, homogeneous Indian peninsula, end quote. In his 8 years as Governor-General, he did his best to make that a reality, annexing 250,000 miles of territory, more than any other Governor-General. He seized every opportunity to bring land under direct company rule. Sometimes this came after wars, such as the Second Anglo-Sikh War, when the Sikh Empire was annexed, bringing Punjab and the northwest frontier into the company state. The Second Anglo-Burma War conquered the southern half of modern-day Myanmar. But more worryingly for Indian clients of the company, Dalhousie also pursued the doctrine of lapse.
This is a doctrine that says that in any state that is indirectly under the company's control, if the current ruler does not have a legitimate heir upon that ruler's death, then the lapsed government will instead devolve onto the company, and it'll become an area of direct rule.
Dalhousie pursued this policy against multiple Indian rulers, but 3 in particular stand out. The first was the widow of Gangadhar Rao, Maharaja of Jhansi, when he died without a direct male heir. That widow, the Rani Lakshmibai, was given a pension of 60,000 rupees a year and evicted from the royal fort, along with the young boy which she and her late husband had adopted on his deathbed. Adoption had long been an accepted part of succession in India, even under the East India Company. But with Dalhousie as Governor-General, these traditions were no longer respected. Another important victim of the doctrine of lapse was the adopted heir of the last Maratha Peshwa, Nana Sahib. Again, his status as an adoptee was used by the company to deny him his adopted father's pension, despite intense lobbying in London and Calcutta. The third, and one which was incredibly damaging to the relationship between the company and its Indian clients, was the Nawab of Awadh.
The classic case was often offered, look what was done to the King of Awadh. There was a treaty made with the King of Awadh in 1837, and that treaty was broken by Lord Dalhousie in 1856, and Awadh was annexed.
The last King of Awadh was evicted from his palace and placed in a comfortable exile in Calcutta, as his kingdom was incorporated into the company state. Dalhousie's justification was that Awadh was being mismanaged and poorly governed, which was questioned at the time and now, and that excuse did not ease the fears of many of the company's other client rulers. Worse, the degradation of the Mughal emperor, now King of Delhi, was due to get worse. Plans were being laid to remove the last scion of Babur from the old capital. If the King of Delhi didn't even have Delhi, what would be left? It appeared that the British company was prepared to dismantle every remnant of Indian autonomy. If Awadh could be arbitrarily seized and the Mughal emperor deposed, what guarantee did any other ruler have?
At every level, there was intervention and erosion taking place, and this was a deliberate act on the part of British rulers. And this needed to be stopped. The British attempt could only be stopped by overthrowing and defeating the British military.
But what really escalated the Meerut Mutiny, and which terrified the British, was the enthusiastic involvement of civilians, again from Mukherjee.
This leadership commanded and received considerable amount of support from common people. By common people, I mean peasants of various sizes and strata, artisans, small traders in the urban settlements in North India. But these people had a set of different reasons to join the uprising. All these people in various ways over 50, 60 years of the 19th century and part of the 18th century had been victims of British exploitative policies. They had been victims of overassessment of the land tax, land revenue. They had been victims of the process of what historians have called deindustrialization, the destruction of indigenous manufacturing in India. So they had their own reasons as well for joining the uprising against the British. But the overall concern also was that not only our livelihood in terms of exploitation, in terms of industrialization was being threatened, but even our value system, our ways of living were being threatened by the coming of the Firangi and the establishment of the Firangi rule. So therefore, this in places like Awadh, where the calculation was 2/3 of the adult male population had actually taken to arms, people came out to oppose the British and throw out the British.
The spark for the 1857 mutinies was, famously, the widespread belief that the new cartridges for the Sepoys rifles were greased with pig and cow fat as part of a plot to convert them. This was an incredibly prevalent rumour, despite it not being true at all. In many cases, Sepoys bought their own grease and applied it themselves, and at the epicenter of the 1857 uprising, Meerut, the new guns and cartridges hadn't been delivered yet. There were similar rumours that the British were grinding bones into the flour in the markets, for example, and British officers recorded their bewilderment when their troops stated these claims as common knowledge. The first bloodshed of 1857 wasn't at Meerut in May. It was at Barrackpore, just north of Calcutta, on the 29th of March. Just like elsewhere in India, the sepoys stationed at Barrackpore were seriously concerned with what they'd been hearing, and feared that the company was intent on forcing them out of caste, or otherwise reducing the social status of sepoys. Their fears were summarised in an anonymous petition intended for Major General Hearsay. The representation of the whole station is this, that we shall not give up our religion. We serve for honour and religion. If we lose our religion, and the Hindu and Mohammedan religions will be destroyed. If we live, what shall we do? You are the masters of this country. We know this, as all things are brought up by government. The officers of the salt department mix up bones with the salt. The officer in charge of the ghee mixes up fat with it. This is well known. The third is this, that the sahib in charge of the sugar burns up bones and mixes them in syrup the sugar is made of. This is well known. All knows it. And this is another affair, that throughout the country the wives of respectable men, in fact, of all classes of Hindus, on becoming widows, are to be married again. This is known. You all obey the orders of the company, which we all know, but a king, or any other one who acts unjustly, does not remain. Also included in the petition is the claim that the cartridges were greased and intended to destroy caste. But with the exception of the matter of remarrying widows, which had been the subject of the Widow Remarriage Act of 1856, these fears were groundless. They were just rumours and, if you will, hearsay, said Major General Hearsay at a speech of the 18th of March. Hearsay was convinced he had finally put the matter to bed. Which takes us to the 29th of March, when Mangal Pandey, a Brahmin sepoy in the 34th BNI, made history after he heard the news that European soldiers had just arrived outside Barrackpore. Driven by the nervousness shared by his regiment and not a small amount of bang, Mangal Pandey attempted to rouse his fellow sepoys into mutiny. Armed with his musket and sword, he ran out of the building and onto the parade ground, calling out for his comrades to join him, even as he loaded his rifle. What followed was a confusing standoff, with Mangal Pandey occasionally firing at the British officers as they took cover behind trees and walls. The other sepoys mostly refused to budge, either to arrest Mangal Pandey as ordered, or to join him in his one-man mutiny. When the British officers tried to seize him themselves, the sepoy fought them off with his rifle and his tulwar, seriously wounding both men. Then a Muslim sepoy joined in, grabbing Mangal Pandey around the waist, only for one of the other Hindu sepoys to now get involved, hitting the two white officers from behind with his rifle butt. With the Europeans knocked down, the Muslim sepoy was pressured to let go of Mangal Pandey. All this while the Jemadar, the officer who was in theory in charge of all these sepoys, was trying to avoid getting blamed for anything. Eventually, Major General Hearsay arrived on the scene and personally led the advance on Mangal Pandey. The sepoy fired and missed and quickly reloaded, but knowing that he wasn't fighting his way out of this, he tried to turn the rifle on himself. He fired, but the awkward angle didn't kill him, and left him grievously wounded instead. He was also briefly on fire, the point-blank gunshot igniting his jacket. Mangal Pandey was taken to hospital, where his wound was treated. At his trial, he insisted he had acted alone, and under the influence of bang. He was found guilty and hanged, and Hearsay had the rest of the sepoys witness his hanging body. The unfortunate Jamadar, Izuri Pandey, was also hanged for failing to keep the situation under control and allowing British officers to be wounded. The bulk of the 34th Regiment was also ordered disbanded. Sheikh Pultu, the Muslim sepoy who had tried to help, was an exception, and instead he was promoted and recommended by Hearsay for the Order of Merit. The hope and belief among the British commanders was that the news of this failed mutiny, the swift justice which followed, and the reward of loyalty would calm sepoy passions until the rumours of grease and bone passed. They would be sorely mistaken. As a sign of things to come, just days before the rest of the 34th was due to disband, Sheikh Pultu was lured to an isolated spot and murdered by his former comrades. The growing resentment towards British rule created a fertile ground for these rumours to spread, and after the initial mutiny at Meerut, there were mutinies and revolts all across North India. Looking at a map in Saul David's The Indian Mutiny, there were outbreaks as far south as Kolhapur, as far east as Chittagong, most west as Peshawar, but the vast majority of mutinies occurred in the Bengal Presidency armies stationed in modern Uttar Pradesh, around the major cities under direct company rule. Exactly what was the most important factor in this is very strongly debated amongst historians. Marxist historians view it mostly as a peasant revolt, driven by British industrialisation and the introduction of the railways and the telegraph, and the changes to Indian society these developments brought. Military historians tend to see the discrimination between European and Indian soldiers as laying the kindling which caught fire at Meerut. Political historians view the annexationist policies of the company as motivating nobles to back the revolt. Religion plays a key part, of course, and the activity of Christian missionaries angered both Hindus and Muslims, providing fertile ground for rumours of grease and bone flour plots. The poor treatment of the Mughal emperor was also a widespread grievance. Economic historians point to how India was shifting from an export economy to an import economy, with British goods flooding Indian markets and destroying livelihoods. Company policies dispossessed more than just the noble elite. Pastoral communities were evicted from their ancestral lands so that more sedentary peasants could be planted there to better use the land, in the company's view. Any local resistance to any of these factors was crushed with ruthless brutality by company troops. But when those troops turned on that company, all those grievances could now see some release. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones makes the very convincing point that the fuel of the uprising of 1857 was a mix of all of these, and that it's important to recognise that not all of them applied everywhere equally. To quote from her, "There was something in the company's policy to annoy and alarm nearly everyone. Taken separately, these genuine local grievances might have been worked through if the company had been prepared to negotiate, or even back down in the face of popular opposition, but it was not." It's important to note that opposition to the company and British rule was not universal. There are always winners in changes like this. Wealthy Indian moneylenders, merchants and urban elites benefited from the infrastructure, and, key to British rule surviving the initial uprising, the company was still supported by many people. Through a combination of carrot and stick, the British would keep control over the majority of their territory and armies. This had limitations. The company was reluctant to send their other presidency armies against the mutineers, terrified that they would make common cause with the insurrectionists. Which leads us into the question of what to actually call these events. And that is tied into historiography and politics. The most common name for these events, at least in Britain, is the Indian Mutiny, sometimes the Sepoy Mutiny. The crisis which rocked British rule for 18 months did begin with the mutiny at Meerut, and it's followed by other mutinies all across North India. Contemporaries, particularly the British, found some comfort in calling it a mutiny. It implied not only that it was limited to the sepoys, but that it wasn't that big of a deal. Oh, it's just a mutiny. Mutinies happen all the time. Pass the brandy. By limiting the people involved to rogue sepoys, it narrowed the field of grievances. The sepoys were carried away with baseless rumours and superstition, all orchestrated by conspirators among the elite. Contemporaries didn't have to look too closely at the wider context to seek out the different and varied grievances which came together after the mutiny sparked a more general uprising. I spoke to Mark Kondos, senior lecturer in Imperial and Global History at King's College London and a specialist in British military rule.
A lot of people in Britain refer to it as the mutiny. They see it as this very violent, which it was, but also sort of tinged with sort of colonial tropes and narratives about the backwardness of Indians, the fanaticism in particular of the Indians during the uprising. And it really obscures the wider, more complex socio-political and economic factors that contributed to the uprising.
At the opposite end of the political spectrum, we have the War of Indian Independence. This was first coined in print by V.D. Savarkar, an Indian nationalist we will certainly be spending a lot more time on in the future. Savarkar published his book, The Indian War of Independence, for the 50th anniversary of these events.
Savarkar obviously had a political axe to grind, and with using these events as sort of a unifying narrative to rally Indians behind the nationalist project more generally. So it had very political and sort of very emotive connotations there.
Savarkar adopts many of the conspiratorial tropes of the British accounts, but flips them on their head. The villains became heroes, the heroes villains. The conspiracy was real, but so well hidden, and its members so devoted to the cause that the British had no inkling of what was about to happen. The fact that there's no historical record to justify its existence, or that the papers of the supposed leaders of the plot only talk vaguely about their dissatisfaction with British rule and policies, becomes examples of how well hidden it was. Because there isn't any evidence of a widespread plot, and the three figures who became major leaders of the rebellion, the Rani of Jhansi, Nana Sahib and Bahadur Shah, when they first learned of the mutiny of the Sepoys, their first reaction was to contact the British, either requesting help restoring order, like the Mughal Emperor and the Rani of Jhansi, or offering their support in putting it down, like Nana Sahib. Those last two would, in time, throw themselves fully behind the uprising, but there's no evidence that they were part of any organised opposition to company rule before the Sepoys mutinied. Savarkar does make one significant change to the British legend, besides morally inverting it. The cartridges were greased with pig and cow fat, and this was a deliberate plan by the British to subvert caste and religion. The mutiny, and then the War of Independence, was therefore a justified response, a preemptive strike. Savarkar's book was banned before it was even translated into English, and he would be convicted of sedition in 1910. But like I said, he'll be back.
For Indian nationalists today, again, they refer to it as the First War of Independence. It assumes the connotations of a heroic struggle against the oppressive tyranny of the British. And again, it's a very simplified view of history that leaves out a lot of complexity of these events.
Between these two traditional accounts sit most modern historians.
I would call it the Indian Uprising of 1857, and a lot of sort of the best scholars working on this prefer that sort of language as opposed to the more politicized terms of mutiny or First War of Independence.
I also asked Kim Wagner, Professor of Imperial and Global History at King's College London and expert on the events of 1857, about how we should refer to these events.
It's quite complex historical events that are summarized under a single label. I tend to use the term Indian Uprising as a shorthand. Parts of the events of 1857 did constitute what was technically a mutiny amongst the Indian troops fighting for the East India Company, but parts of it was much more of a sort of popular rebellion, anti-colonial in many instances. The best way to sort of gauge historians' politics is to see how they describe it. If they refer to it as the Indian Mutiny, the likelihood is that they engage with British scholarship that is somewhat out of date. If they call it the First War of Indian Independence, you know they'll have an Indian nationalist slant to their scholarship. So like most other historical events, the labels, they give away quite a bit. The name such as the First Indian War of Independence is actually quite interesting because there wasn't really a sense of an India which could gain independence in 1857. And by describing it as the First War of Independence, it's quite clear that Indian nationalists in the 20th century were trying to instigate a second war of independence.
Among other words used to describe these events, Mahmoud Farooqi suggests another, Gadar, meaning outburst, mayhem, rebellion, rot, and disturbance. It was used by contemporaries, particularly in Delhi, and in his view, encapsulates the multidimensional nature of the event far better than a more restrictive label. The events of 1857 and 1858 were not merely mutinies, and they weren't quite a national war of independence. But whatever they were, they started at Meerut on the 10th of May, 1857. Most British officers and civilian officials were complacent about the growing tension among their native troops. Complaints by sepoys and warnings from Indian officers about the cartridges were ignored. The British didn't appreciate how sincerely these rumours were believed, or how serious the consequences would be for sepoys to use the cartridges if they were greased with pig and cow fat. For the British, it was simply superstition and ignorance, and not worth taking seriously. All they needed to do was to tell the sepoys that the rumours were false and then enforce military discipline. To quote from Professor Wagner's book, The Great Fear of 1857, applying a distinctly Western interpretation to a religion they despised, they found it impossible to believe that the grievances of the Indian troopers were sincere. An example of how poorly the British understood the situation, they forced the issue of the cartridges and imprisoned 85 troopers, some of whom were Muslim, during Ramadan. This was an incredibly inflammatory decision, but the British didn't recognise that it was, and they still believed that military discipline would be maintained. It wasn't that the British didn't try to calm sepoy fears about the cartridges, because they did try, but they never appreciated that the rumours were a symptom of much wider dissatisfaction and suspicion, which could quickly escalate to violent hatred. But there were exceptions. The Commissioner of Meerut, Hervey Greathead, is a good example of this. Writing in April 1857,
"The gulf between the European and the Asiatic has naturally grown wider, the latter being a stationary character, and among mortal men superiority must be met by more or less hate. But as our power of accommodation increases and theirs decreases, as long as we feel ourselves in the right, we have nothing to fear."
Greathead was an experienced civil servant outside the military establishment. This perhaps gave him a clearer picture of how many Indian soldiers saw their European officers, but it also meant that he was easily ignored by the military authorities. But some officers realised that something was brewing. Lieutenant Edward Martineau of the 10th BNI was one of these. He tried to get an official inquiry started to discover how mutinous the army actually was, but he was denied outright. Writing to a friend, he warned,
"We make a grand mistake in supposing that because we dress, arm, and drill Hindustani soldiers as Europeans, they will become one bit European in their feelings and ideas. I see them on parade for, say, 2 hours daily. But what do I know of them for the other 22? What do they talk about in their lines? What do they plot? For all I can tell, I might as well be in Siberia. I know that at the present moment, an unusual agitation is pervading the ranks of the entire native army. But what it will result in, I am afraid to say. I can detect the near approach of the storm. I can hear the moaning hurricane, but I can't say how, when, or where it will break forth. Let us look our position calmly in the face. We are a small body dotted over the face of the land, entirely unsuspicious and unprepared. Why, whence the danger, you say? Everywhere, far and near. The army, under some maddening impulse, are looking out with strained expectation for something. Some unseen, invisible agency has caused one common electric thrill to run through all. I don't think they know themselves what they will do, or that they have any plan of action except of resistance to invasion of their religion and their faith. But good God, here are all the elements of combustion at hand. 100,000 men, sullen, distrustful, fierce, with all their deepest and inmost sympathies, as well as worst passions, roused, and we thinking to cajole them into good humor by patting them on the back, saying, "What a fool you are for making such a fuss about nothing." They no longer believe us. They have passed out of restraint and will be off at a gallop before long. If a flare-up from any cause takes place at one station, it will spread and become universal. Then, what means have we for putting it down? Well, call me alarmist. Call me a coward if you choose. I calmly await the opening scene of the drama and prophecy, and if it will not be melodramatic enough to make all the world stare, I am vastly mistaken.
Martineau's prescient warning was written 5 days before the curtain rose in Meerut, and the opening scene he'd predicted began. As we heard in the opening vignette, on the 10th of May 1857, the bulk of the 11th and 20th Bengal Native Infantry and the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry mutinied, and together with the townsfolk, killed every European they could find. The European soldiers also stationed at Meerut were eventually ordered into the town the following morning, but by then most of the mutineers had left, marching towards Delhi. It would take weeks for the British to fully reconquer Meerut, but the morning after the mutiny the first British soldiers moved down into Meerut, searching for survivors and assessing the damage, almost as if the town had been hit by a natural disaster. What they found horrified them, and if you are squeamish, you should skip forward a few minutes. A search party was sent to the house of one Sergeant Law. His wife had managed to escape to the British lines carrying their youngest child, but she'd been forced to leave behind her husband and their 3 other children. The search party
found him lying about 40 yards in front of his dwelling, with his body ripped open and his head cut off. And one of his children, a girl aged 6 years and a half, lying dead a few yards from him. In the house, 2 children were found alive. One, Eliza, aged 9 years and 10 days, had her arms hacked off the shoulders and left hanging only by the skin, besides having both of her cheeks cut off so that no fluid could be retained in the mouth. The other, a boy upwards of 5 years of age, had a part of his ear cut off, besides being otherwise severely wounded. These 2 children were conveyed in a litter to the artillery hospital, where the girl died the next day.
Another party, led by Captain Chambers, rushed to his house to search for his pregnant wife. One account describes him finding her dead, stripped naked, and her unborn child cut out of her. Another account, by one Captain Earl, describes the scene like this.
Early next morning, Miss Chambers' body was found in her compound. I saw the body covered up. Cannot say in what state it was. Just by the old jail, we found the bodies of some 14 or 15 European soldiers and their wives. All these were perfectly naked and frightfully mutilated. One man had one of his hands entirely cut off. Another had the whole of his stomach laid bare, with the entrails hanging out. Miss MacDonald was so much disfigured from the cuts about her face that although I had known her intimately for upwards of 9 years, I did not recognize her. Captain MacDonald, 20th Regiment Native Infantry, and Mr. V. Traeger were killed in the lines by the Sepoys of the 20th Native Infantry. Both these gentlemen were shot.
I'm not including these accounts just to shock or appall you, even if that's what they do. It's not for sensationalism either. There are much more sensationalist accounts, especially recorded later, as the events of the uprising become legends of empire, alongside the Black Hole of Calcutta, as a warning for later generations. I include them partly for that reason. The atrocities of Meerut and elsewhere in the early days and weeks of the uprising become a rallying cry for the British, and, particularly in the case of British women, the assumption was that they had been sexually assaulted as well. Witnessing these atrocities and reading the increasingly dramatic accounts of other atrocities fed into the British belief that they had only narrowly escaped a widespread conspiracy. The outrage and horror at the violence and the betrayal fed into a rage which demanded reciprocation. Some of that rage manifested a few days later. A butcher, Mola Baksh, was recognised by an Indian servant as one of the murderers of Mrs. Chambers. He was caught trying to leave the town disguised under a woman's shawl. Commissioner Greathead, who we heard from earlier, was the senior civilian official in town, and he confirmed that civil law had failed. The judge advocate, Colonel Harriet, then declared martial law, and within minutes, he and 5 other officers had set up courts martial. Baksh's fate was never in doubt, and his body was soon hanging from a tree. He was just the first. Scores of civilians were rounded up and brought before those who had witnessed the uprising. Anyone recognised, or thought to have been recognised, as having taken part in any violence, arson or looting, was hanged. At least 49 Europeans were killed in the Meerut Mutiny, but only 22 were clearly identified. The rest were too mutilated or burned to be recognised. There were undoubtedly many innocent Indians who were summarily executed by the British in the aftermath, and in unofficial retaliatory violence. As Kim Wagner suggests, we have to assume that many Indian civilians were killed in the initial violence too. To quote him, "The fact that they were never mentioned in the British accounts and their fate went unrecorded should not make us insensitive to their suffering. The silence in the archives is a poignant reminder of the many stories of the uprising that will never be told." End quote. Of the mutineers who left Meerut, most set off down the road to Delhi. The Sawars of the BLC, mounted on horseback, were usually at the front, with the infantry and the civilians who had joined them stretched all along the road behind them. They travelled through the night. In Delhi, the last anyone had heard from Meerut had been on the 9th, with the excited gossip, as well as you could gossip through a telegraph, about the fates of the 85 troopers. On Sunday, the telegraph office was closed through the heat of noon, and when they reopened at 4 p.m, the telegraph staff found they couldn't reach Meerut. Curious, but not concerned, they decided to check the line the following morning. Other signs and warnings filtered in. A British family was warned by an Indian noble that the sentencing of the 85 troopers at Meerut would have serious repercussions. The family sent word to the authorities, who ignored the warning. A couple of hours later, a messenger from Meerut arrived. Loyal Sawars had been sent by junior British officers to warn Delhi, and they'd pass the word along as their horses tired. The note reached the Commissioner of Delhi, Simon Fraser, who was dozing in his chair after a heavy dinner. Woken by servants and given the letter, he put it in his pocket and went back to sleep. The following morning, as the first of the mutineers closed in on Delhi, the sepoy regiments of the 38th, 54th and 74th BNI were mustered to hear the news that Izuri Pandey, the Jamadar of Barakpur, had been hanged. It was meant to cow the sepoys, but a British captain noted the news caused a lot of hissing and shuffling. Then, the British went to have breakfast. Around 7 a.m, 30 mutinous Sawars arrived at the bridge of boats. They killed the toll collector and George Todd, the telegraph officer who had just arrived to examine the line and work out what had gone wrong the previous day. Then, the mutineers entered the city. It did not take much for British authority over the old Mughal capital to crumble. With no forces of British regulars nearby, the mutineers and many Delhi citizens turned on the Daryaganj district, home of many European and Indian Christians. Sepoy guards were passive or actively joined in. The scenes at Meerut were repeated, with Europeans and known Christian converts murdered all across the city. The leading figures of British rule in Delhi took shelter in the apartments of Captain Charles Douglas, commander of the Palace Guard. Reverend Jennings, who was a known proselytizer of Christianity and deeply unpopular for it. Commissioner Fraser, who had pushed for the royal family to be disinherited and evicted from Delhi. Magistrate Hutchinson, representative of hated British law. Captain Douglas himself, who represented the company and their plan to outcast their devoted sepoys. These men, and 2 women who were sheltering with them, now found themselves at the mercy of the royal retinue, who needed little encouragement to turn their weapons on the hated British. Ignoring Bahadur Shah's orders to protect the men and escort the women to safety with the Queen, the Palace Guard killed them all. Many of the sepoys of the 38th, 54th and 74th BNI either deserted or defected as it became clear that British rule was collapsing. Officers were gunned or cut down, either by their own soldiers or by other mutineers, as their sepoys abandoned them. Soon, Kashmir Gate was the last British position in the city. Survivors of the riots fled through, each with harrowing stories. The officers at the gate were convinced that their soldiers were on the brink of turning on them too. They kept asking, with worrying interest, if the British reinforcements were nearby. Outside the walls of Delhi, the magazine was guarded by sepoys of the 38th BNI under the command of Lieutenant Willoughby. They watched from a distance as smoke rose into the sky, unsure about what was happening. An Indian official arrived outside the magazine. He stated that the magazine was now under Bahadur Shah's command, and he was soon backed up by soldiers of the Palace Guard. The sepoys were encouraged to desert their positions, and the British officers were to be taken to the palace for their safety. When siege ladders appeared, the sepoys began deserting in droves, leaving their officers to fight alone. After a desperate defence, Willoughby decided to detonate the gunpowder stores. Somehow, he survived the explosion and escaped Delhi, only to be later killed by villagers. At 5 p.m, the Kashmir Gate was abandoned, and they began to fall back to Flagstaff Tower. When the former garrison of the Kashmir Gate saw the magazine explode, they cheered and began to march back to the gate, firing at any officer who got in their way. Soon, the roads away from Delhi were full of refugees. Inside the Red Fort, Bahadur Shah was being pressured to give his support to the rebellion. He'd already sent a messenger to the British at Agra requesting help, but they were more than 200 miles away. There were thousands of rebel soldiers in his city, which was riven with riots and violence. In reality, it was no choice at all. Bahadur Shah Zafar took his seat on his throne, and the officers and soldiers of his new army came to pay homage to him as their new master. At midnight of the 11th of May, a 21-gun salute boomed out of the Red Fort, announcing the restoration of Mughal rule. Less than 24 hours since the mutiny at Meerut, the British Empire in India had been dealt a mortal blow. Or had it? Next time, we will see how the British respond to the widespread mutinies and uprisings which follow the news of Delhi and Meerut.
Suddenly, as the sepoys are going out into the countryside, they are passing through villages and they're spreading the word. British rule is falling, and people start to see the British are not in charge anymore. The sepoys are assuming control of the countryside.
The Grand Trunk Road over which this army marched was lined with trees, and he said there was scarcely a tree on either side of the road that did not have 4 to 5 Indians who had just been strung up and killed. There was no trial, there was no search for evidence if these were rebels or not. They were considered to be rebels and just killed mercilessly. Villages were just burnt.
1858 will see the end of 2 empires, the Empire of the Mughals and the Empire of the East India Company. If you have enjoyed this episode of Winds of Change, please share it with a friend. Open your podcast app and send a link to someone you know will enjoy it just as much as you. Thank you to our guests, Christina Welsch, Kim Wagner, Mark Kondos, and Rudrangshu Mukherjee. You can find the full details of our guests and their published work in the episode notes. Featuring the talented voice work of Bruce Carlson, host of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Go give it a listen. All research, writing and production by me, Samuel Hume. Thank you to the University of Aberdeen Special Collections. And of course, thank you for listening.